Welcome to Beyond the Session, the show where you can hear real talk between therapists. Here's today's intro from ChatGPT. Join us for therapy without the filter, where honesty is the only policy and authenticity reigns supreme. Van, you're not aware that we do that every single time. It's super cheesy, but there's something endearing about how the computer comes up with taglines for us. Today, we're looking outside the therapy room and into our community, exploring how everyone's collective mental health contributes to our own personal mental health. In episode 3, I think it was, we talked with Jessica about how there's a tiered access to mental health and how affordability is often a barrier to receiving good quality mental health care. So we might revisit that concept a bit today, as well as exploring what community looks like and how community design and services can contribute to our individual mental health. We have Van Shanahan joining us on the show. He's an RP with Reset Counseling, and he has served for many years in community mental health with very vulnerable and unhoused members of our community. He's joining Andi and I in the studio, and we're exploring ways to foster compassionate communities. Hey, Van.
Hi, good morning.
And Andi.
Hi.
Let's dive into this. I want to ask how our community attitudes are reflected in the treatment of vulnerable people.
It's a very large question.
It's a big question. So, I mean, Van, you've worked with unhoused populations. The way that an overall community thinks about mental health and about people who are severely struggling with mental health, it kind of shows up in the way that we are voting towards services or against services, right? It almost becomes political, our collective opinions about mental health.
It's very political. The way vulnerable populations, and that is really a broad label, whether we're talking about street-involved people, especially people living outside, unhoused populations, or just people who have experienced some sort of trauma, who have been dealing with various physical or mental health issues. The treatment that they receive from their community depends on the specific community they find themselves in, as well often with the specific challenges that they face. People who might be experiencing similar mental health struggles will be treated at large very differently depending on if they are visibly, street involved versus if they are housed, working, if they're on ODSP, if they're on OW. The various intersections really do make a huge difference in the way they're treated by various social services is a reflection of how the community often views them at large.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I love sharing the story of in 2015, Medicine Hat, Alberta. I don't know if you're familiar, but they declared an end to homelessness in their community. And I think it's just like such a powerful story because what happened was a bunch of leaders and landowners in the community got together. They said, hey, we're a tiny town in the middle of the prairies. Like, why do we have so much homelessness? Let's create space for people to live. And so people were like donating actual units for people to live in. And it's kind of the housing first idea, right? Where first, you get a roof over someone's head, and that takes away a lot of the vulnerability of safety, of exposure. So when some of those safety concerns are addressed, as well as giving people dignity, they feel like I have a place to be proud of. I have value, I have worth. When some of those things are given to people, then it can be life-changing, right? It can give them the opportunity to actually address their mental health concerns. Whereas when you're, on the street or in a really vulnerable position, maybe you're couch surfing or something, then it's hard to be able to, work on whatever your mental health concerns are because you're living day to day, moment to moment, hand to mouth in a lot of instances, right? So unfortunately, Medicine Hat, they kept that status for 4 months. I think there was less than 2 people who were unhoused. And then unfortunately, circumstances changed and the pandemic happened and they experienced the same kind of overwhelming crisis that is happening in communities across Canada and no doubt other places. But I just like the example because it shows how when a community decides, it's not just, this is a problem for us. It's more like we want to have compassion on people who are having a hard time.
Yeah.
And so when we have that compassion and empathy towards people, then how can we actually make a meaningful difference in people's lives and thereby make our community a great place to live and affect our own sense of self and our own sense of, our safety, our well-being, our own sense of dignity.
And I think even developing that empathy and that compassion can sometimes be a barrier to implementing any sort of, recognizing that it's a problem and implementing any solution. As human beings, we have biases. This is not always a bad thing. It helps us function more efficiently in a lot of ways. But it's important to recognize the biases that we're prone to so that we can actively and consciously work to overcome them. The one that comes to mind here is it's called the just world hypothesis. And it's the idea that, for our own sense of sort of security or safety, we need to believe that the world is a just place on some level and that people get what they deserve. And you see this bias sort of applied when you see maybe an unhoused person, and there's that tendency for some of us to think, oh, they must have made a mistake. They must have done something wrong. That could never happen to me. Now, I do think that gap is shrinking a little bit, especially since COVID. It seems like some of the more visible, vulnerable populations that used to sort of be more so on the fringe, it's becoming a lot more visible now and a lot more common, which could potentially result in having more empathy. But again, there is that human bias. There is that tendency to be very sort of tribal and turn on each other.
Yeah.
So being aware and conscious of those things is also vital. Because the empathy doesn't come to everybody automatically, right? It can be tough.
Yeah. And there's kind of that idea of those like old school ideas, like, well, why don't they just stop drinking? Like, why don't they stop doing drugs? Why do they keep doing this? And it's just like such a misunderstanding of mental health and how it works. And I mean, Van, maybe you can speak a little bit to how people even end up in very vulnerable situations.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the change we saw through the COVID pandemic and these groups of people, various marginalized populations who we might have seen as, or might describe as being more on the fringe previously, becoming a lot more visible and noticeable in our community. And over the past few years, especially in our community here, the issue has become a lot more visible. Our local unhoused population really grew through the pandemic, and even a couple years later now, continue to see more people experiencing homelessness and experiencing mental health and substance abuse issues for a variety of reasons. As you were describing, people do have a tendency to think, okay, this person is in this situation because surely they did something that led to these consequences. People tend to assume that people wound up in situations like experiencing homelessness due to something that these people got themselves into, and really put the onus and responsibility on them.
Right, like it was their bad choices that led to this.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. You mentioned attitudes like, why doesn't this person just stop drinking, just stop using drugs, as if it is that simple. And, a matter of sheer willpower. But it's so rarely that simple. Through the pandemic, especially with those early lockdowns, we saw a lot of people lose their jobs, lose their businesses. All of a sudden, people can't afford rent. They can't afford their mortgage payments.
And the housing market exploded too, which landlords are trying to bump rents all the time. And it's like, if you're, on OW, your check coming in is like, what, $600 if you're on a basic individual OW check. So then there's nowhere that you can get a room for that amount, let alone buy food for yourself, right?
Yeah, especially here in Barrie. A lot of people end up in a position where they don't have an income now for a rent that, there's a good chance that they could barely afford to begin with, possibly already living paycheck to paycheck because, wages can be pretty stagnant and minimum wage doesn't really meet cost of living. So they wind up in a position where can't afford a shelter anymore. They can't afford their rent. They can't afford their mortgage. They're forced out with nowhere to go. Okay, how many people did have pre-existing mental health? There's certainly a percentage that do, but you wind up in a situation like that where you don't know if you're going to have a roof over your head. Now you don't know if you're going to have a meal that night. That leads to trauma. That leads to overwhelming amounts of stress, which can then lead to, hey, a drink might help me fall asleep.
Yeah.
Opioids, some type of substance might make me feel at least good for a couple hours. When you get down to it, it's really much of a question why someone might want to give that a shot.
Right.
Everything seems so hopeless.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, I've seen stats before that I think it's upwards of 70-80% of people who are street involved, they grew up with childhood abuse, like severe abuse, I'm talking, right? So then that plays into their existence. They're still processing that trauma in some way, haven't had the right kind of care for that. So then like that's kind of one scenario, or another scenario might be, I've met people who are street involved that they got in an accident and had a major injury and it they got off work and then they got addicted to the painkillers. And then because of that addiction, they ended up, stealing from their spouse or their kids. And, it just kind of starts breaking relationships. And then you end up turfed out. The people that love you, they have to build a boundary because there's just like an infringement on their rights and their property, right? Like that addiction kind of is taken over in a way that is harming those relationships, and people end up all alone and often on the street.
I've also seen a lot within my own practice, many clients who have had their relationships impacted, again, by COVID, by the lockdowns, right? It's a pretty unnatural situation to be cooped up with your partner, your kids, your siblings, whoever it is, for that long, right? It is sort of a breeding ground for a lot of conflict and things like that. And what I'm seeing a lot of with my clients is people who have either become unhoused because they have separated and now they can't afford to go somewhere, or people who are staying in living situations that are really, really not good for their mental health. But the alternative is to go live on the streets.
Right, exactly. We're not just talking about like quote unquote poor people that are on the street. Like we're talking
These
about
are like, middle class people.
Exactly. And there's couples where both of them have a decent job, they're working and everything else. And it's like, we're staying together in an unhealthy relationship so that we're not on the streets, literally. Like I can't afford the mortgage on my own. I can't get out of it. I can't buy out my partner. So like a lot of people are like really stuck.
Especially if kids are involved. And then, both parents ideally want to have a place that has multiple bedrooms so that they can also have visits with their kids. And then you get people who are in situations where they have to choose between, having parenting time with their children and having, I guess, a place to sleep.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's where just community realities, the rise in real estate, it benefited a lot of people. But on the other hand, it put a lot of people out, right? So that's where community realities play into the social realities that are happening now and how that's affecting people's mental health and, just stress that people are feeling. And I think that's across the board, the stress about paying my bills. We're looking at how the state of mental health care in our community can then play into our own mental health. So how can the communal state of mental health play into our own individual mental health, such as our sense of belonging, our sense of safety, our sense of shared existence?
Like on the one hand, you would think that having more people sort of in a similar situation or having similar struggles, like maybe this is the thing that bands us together for change. Given human nature, I think it's also possible, right, that breeds divisiveness and conflict. There's scarcity of resources. So sort of finding your tribe and fighting for what you can grab. And again, there has to be that conscious effort to recognize that and overcome that rather than just othering people, right? Making them the enemy when it's not our fellow man or our fellow human who is the enemy.
I remember there was a time where the Busby Center was actually relocated temporarily, fairly close to us. And the neighbors banded together like never before. They were having these meetings in people's houses. And it was kind of like, what do we do about this problem? There was a very real thing happening. Like we're walking to the playground and there's open drug use. And I'm like, I don't want my kids exposed to that. People had concerns about safety and everything else. So there's kind of a tension where it's like, on one hand, we want to be compassionate towards people. We want to be empathetic to what they're going through. But on the other hand, I don't want my kids stepping on a needle when they go down the slide, or people are thinking about their property and break-ins that are happening. I remember seeing a group of people in broad daylight peeking into a house that someone had just moved out of, and they're seeing if there's anything good in there to kind of get out. So there's always kind of that tension between our own individual rights, our property rights, our rights about safety, and then our collective experience and how we want our community to be thriving. We want people to have the services that they need and deserve. How do you approach that tension, I guess, in your work, Van?
It's a tricky situation. As you mentioned, people do have a right to privacy. They have a right to safety and security and feeling safe in their homes and their neighborhoods. An event like what you described, like the David Busby Center, having to move temporarily into maybe a more residential area, that brings a lot of concerns for a lot of people. We talked about, the bias around people that are street involved, and now people start thinking, wow, now a hub for those people are going to be near my home. People get scared. They get scared of the possibilities.
Yeah.
And it can be hard for people in those situations to have empathy for the vulnerable people that are making them feel scared and unsafe.
Or they can have empathy as long as it's, what do they say, NIMBY, not in my backyard.
Yeah.
They are okay with funding it, but they don't want to see it.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is these services have to be located somewhere. Even though someone might not have a home to live in, they're still members of our community and they're our neighbors.
Yeah.
Even if they're living in a tent at the park, they're still a neighbor.
There's like a dehumanizing that happens sometimes, right? As a way of, in a way of maybe like protecting ourselves or our own sense of safety, or even walking around and having some of, like the open drug use, or having some of the unhoused individuals, or there's a lot of panhandlers at the highway intersections. It's sort of acts as this constant reminder, but I don't know if it's in a way, again, that helps us develop empathy or makes us more scared of our own, future and of our own safety.
Right.
What you mentioned, Kathleen, about, the idea of finding needles in the park or people breaking into people's houses, the question that comes up for me is, are those things that are indicative of someone not caring about the community that they're in and involved with, is that going to become more or less likely to happen if they feel like an enemy to the people living in that community and living in those neighborhoods?
Right. Absolutely. And that's where I think of the attitude of, the people who have versus the people who have not, maybe. I don't know how to frame this, but there is kind of
people have some and people who have less.
Exactly. Right. So then if the attitude of the people with some is those people are ashamed to our community and we wish the community would get rid of them. I've heard these things, or they're just a nuisance. I've heard people talk about people panhandling at the intersections, and it's just such a nuisance to them that they have to experience this when they're driving past. If we are constantly othering people, then there comes a point where people don't care anymore what other people think of them because they know they're going to be judged no matter what.
Absolutely. I think of the, considering we're a therapy podcast, I think of the defense mechanism of projective identification, where you project a label or an attitude or an identity onto someone. There can come a point where they just accept it and they embody that.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
If you're dehumanizing someone and treating them like an animal, eventually, they might just get fed up and say, okay, you think of me as an animal, I'm going to be an animal too, because they get beaten down.
Yeah.
And it becomes hard to fight against that.
Yeah. Well, and a throwback to, again, episode 3, our podcast with Jessica, we were talking about myth busting in mental health. And there's this myth that people who have severe mental health conditions are dangerous and, I don't know, like a threat in some way. Whereas in reality, we're using the word vulnerable instead, because it's people who are on the street that they're subjected to so many acts that are re-traumatizing and furthering their trauma. Yeah. And it's just like very sad and very unfortunate, right?
They're more likely to be victims of violent crime, more likely to experience abuse, to be treated poorly by figures of authority like police, but they're seen as the threat.
Yeah, exactly. How can people become more empathetic individually or even collectively? And how can they improve those skills in a therapeutic setting or even just on their own at home?
I think ideally it starts young, right? In a perfect world, we start to explain emotions and explain things in a way that helps our children see that there are different ways of being and different perspectives, and that normalizes that for them. Of course, these are things you can learn or work on later in life as well, and it might take different forms. I'm a huge advocate for volunteering or service within the community, not even just for the fact that it's helpful, but for the fact that it often exposes us to different types of people, different walks of life, even trying different activities or going to different events to meet people who are sort of outside of your own circle can be helpful in building empathy. Actively practicing imagining what somebody might be thinking or stepping out of your own shoes and coming up with maybe not even the opposite perspective, but just a different perspective. Reading is actually a huge one. There's a lot of evidence that shows that reading fiction in particular can help give us insight into sort of the way people's brains work and the different perspectives that they could have on various experiences. I mean, that's a huge one, reading.
That's a great point that I think is undervalued. Reading literature, I was reading or listening to a podcast recently that was talking about mentalization and a big part of fostering the capacity to mentalize is, or one of the suggestions was reading literature, reading other people's points of view, and getting an understanding of why people do things, the things they do, think the things they think, and feel the way they feel.
For sure. And helps to sort of foster that curiosity as well, right? I mean, I might be a little more curious than the average person. That's part of what makes me a therapist, because I just genuinely want to know. But I mean, anybody can practice having that attitude of trying to learn more about different people or asking for their take on something, maybe even seeking out viewpoints that are different from your own, and doing so from a place not of I'm right and they're wrong, or I win and they lose, but of just, broadening perspective, going in open and hoping to actually learn something from the discussion as opposed to claim victory for being right.
Right. Because even at a base level, you're just recognizing not everyone thinks the way that I think. Not everyone's experiences were the same as mine, right? And if you're able to do that, then it does let you walk in someone else's shoes a little bit more. Even if you have no idea where they're coming from, you can just accept that their reality has been different than yours, right?
Right. Even being able to admit that, wow, I cannot imagine that, or I cannot put myself in that person's place, is still a type of information that can help you build empathy toward that person. And even just the way that we treat people, really, like, just being polite, being reasonably friendly and civil to everybody that we meet. And that also sets an example for our children. It sets an example for the people around us. That type of behavior it's contagious, right? Yeah. If we have a lot of people who are treating, for example, street involved people a certain way, it normalizes it. But if people have a different attitude about it, that will also be that upward spiral we talked about earlier.
Yeah. And it starts when we're young, like you said, and when we're talking with our kids about it. Like, my kids ask me sometimes, they're young, they don't really understand what's going on. Half the time, they're not aware of their surroundings necessarily or the people around them. But sometimes they're going, oh, why is that man sleeping under the tree? And I just say, well, he must be tired. Like maybe he had a rough night, right? Or like the way that we talk about our outside neighbors. Some of our neighbors are outside. They don't have a house. But they're still neighbors to us, right? They're not unwanted. They're not pests. You know what I'm saying? We're not trying to get rid of people. We're trying to look for creative ways to get people housed and safe and healthy as they can be, and so on.
One thing that can be really important in fostering or helping to foster empathy is building a capacity for mindfulness and engaging in regular mindfulness practice to foster that skill. Call it a mindfulness muscle. Empathy, we describe empathy as being able to feel or understand how someone else is feeling. I think that becomes a lot easier to do when we are able to understand what we're feeling ourselves, why in that way. Being able to connect those dots. If we can understand that A plus B caused me to feel C type of way, and start to connect those dots with what we witness in other people.
Yeah, it might be looking inward and saying, okay, today, I saw 4 homeless people and I felt unsafe because they appeared to be unhygienic, and I thought about disease transmission, right? Like you can kind of look at that and unpeel it and then recognize, okay, I don't actually have any facts to verify this. Yeah. I don't know if they are experiencing disease. Sometimes we kind of can check ourselves and get under those feelings, and sometimes there's just no basis for it.
And how someone else or other people cause us to feel can also be a good window into how they're feeling. If you see someone in that situation and you have concerns about safety, hygiene, imagine how they feel about it living in it.
Yeah, trying to manage your hygiene when you don't have a bathroom to wash, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's kind of such an upside down way of looking at it, right? Yeah. I'm trying to look in my own brain, I guess. I think there have been times where I've driven by people that they're just in so much pain. They're evidently, visibly hurting. Sometimes it's actually brought me to tears. And I think the thought that goes through my head is, what happened to you? Like what kind of hurts have you experienced to end up here? Who hurt you in your life? Or what events have transpired so that you're now in a place where you're digging through a dumpster for something to wear, you know? And it's just like really heartbreaking if we look at it. But it's not always our first reaction or response, right?
Mentioned seeing people, panhandling, say the highway intersections, and having people having this like visceral issue or problem with that. They feel almost, insulted that they have to bear witness to that. What I get curious about is how much of that is just feelings of discomfort caused perhaps by feeling guilty or having those questions of what happened, not knowing necessarily what to do with those feelings, not always able to make sense of them. We want to get away from discomfort. So that could translate to, okay, I'm going to, agitate for more social services that can address this issue in a productive way. It could work. I'm going to hound my local council person to get the police to crack down on this. Either way, they want something done about it. Whether it's a question of empathy or something else that they don't necessarily know what the right is.
Yeah. I think if I can hear this behind what you're saying is that deep down, a lot of times we do have a sense of sadness for people or a sense of compassion or even a sense of responsibility in some ways. Like, how is our society not providing enough care for people, right? I think about that. I mean, we have tenants and we're very fortunate to have tenants, right? And sometimes I think about, from our perspective, we would love to up the rent. We would love to whitewash the place and get new tenants who are paying more. But then we would be responsible for putting people on the street. So like, we have an ethical choice in front of us and we are very directly responsible in that situation. But then I think about other ways that we are inadvertently responsible, such as our buying choices, right? Like, this is kind of a huge topic that we're not really going to dive into, but like, sometimes we're treating people very cruelly and we don't even know it. But we're buying, shoes that were made in a factory where they use child labor, perhaps. Yeah. You know what I mean? So like, I think that we've set up our society in a way that we've distanced ourselves from it. If that factory was in my backyard that was using child labor, then I would feel bad about it every day. But the fact that it's in a different country, I don't ever have to think about it. There's a lot of kind of ethical questions that we're faced with if we really think about people's severe mental health and how they ended up there and what we're going to do about it, even how we're going to help.
In a lot of cases, outsourcing labor to other countries, which is done to keep costs down, is outsourcing the connection to the products we're buying. It's outsourcing that alienation.
That's kind of a bigger conversation maybe. But then if we look at our own community of Barrie and how we hope to treat people that have severe mental health concerns and are very vulnerable and maybe street involved, a lot of times, again, we do want to put people out of sight and out of mind. We don't want that constant reminder, right? I read a book many years ago and I don't remember what it's called, but it was written by one of the founders of one of the bigger shelters in downtown Toronto. And he was just sharing some of the words of his clients, right? People he was working with that are street involved. And there was a guy who every day would come in and he said, we need to decentralize poverty. That was his line. And his idea was, he's like, if you put all these services together, then it's creating a space for a lot of people who are facing severe mental health and addictions and everything else. They're now all kind of clumped together, and it's not necessarily making the situation better for them. It's in fact putting influencers in their life that may be really negative or perpetuating their situation.
It's a double-edged sword, because these services sprout up where they're needed. Often see them in downtown cores, whether here in Barrie or in other places, because downtown cores have a lot of other resources. They tend to have municipal and provincial or even federal services, like, for example, Service Ontario, Service Canada, ODSP, and Ontario Works might, be congregated.
Right. There's also transportation.
Yeah, transportation, like a bus terminal. So these services sprout up where people in need of them congregate, but then that also then becomes known as the place where these services that the people winding up in those situations, that's known as the place where they can go and access. People wind up there.
Yeah, and I mean, a practice that was recently actually stopped in Barrie was that individuals who have just left incarceration were bussed downtown Barrie, and they're given a ticket to wherever their home is, which then they sell or just don't use and end up couch surfing for a while and then on the street again, right? So like there's just like a really real, it's like the system isn't really working well. So then now they're actually trying to get people closer to their home communities and hopefully give them a fighting chance at getting back on their feet.
That is one of the services that the outreach team with the David Busby Center, one of the services that they provide is if someone has somewhere to stay in another town, you know, in their home community, but for some reason they are buried with nowhere to go, then they'll help to get them transportation to that area.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah. Or I mean, speaking to another vulnerable population, I know of a local church that they have bought up all these houses close to downtown and close to services, and they provide housing for women who are coming out of like halfway houses or transitional housing, because the stats of women returning to situations that are abusive or detrimental in some way, it's just like so high. But then their rate of success with this housing is incredible because they're not just looking for a place for them to stay for a while. They're looking to equip them with furnishings for their new house. Like, you're going to need a toaster oven, you know, and they don't have the means to buy the things to furnish a new place. So they're actually giving them all those things so that they don't feel the need to go back to their old place and try and get some financial security again or material security. Sometimes it's just like the way that we design services can play so much into outcomes. We talked about how we individually and collectively often try and distance ourselves from other people's pain. But then as therapists, and especially Van, in the position you've worked in community mental health, working with vulnerable unhoused populations, how can you avoid burnout? That's kind of the opposite side of empathy, right? When you care too much, when you've cared for so long that it's starting to affect you. How can therapists avoid burnout in their profession?
That is a great question, and it's an important one. That question of compassion fatigue, when we get to the point where we've cared so much, we struggle to have that empathy and struggle to care going forward. I'm not bringing anything new to the table in suggesting general self-care practice. Having things you'd like to do outside of the job, not making our profession our entire life. Having hobby, regular exercise, good sleep, healthy diet, all that stuff, as well as having regular ongoing supervision, having our own therapy and doing our own work. And a really important one is maintaining the therapeutic frame and having boundaries with clients, making sure therapy stays in the therapy room, not being on call with your clients, even, stepping back from that, having set hours that you answer emails and not stepping out of that, because these things lead to wear and tear on our minds, on our hearts. We got to keep ourselves in check and take care of ourselves in order to be able to take care of others.
Yeah, because I think there are some areas of social services where it's just day in and day out. You're seeing really awful cases, really painful ones, and you have to protect yourself and protect your heart, like you said, and your own mental well-being. But then there's a point where you can just become jaded and say, oh my gosh, here we go again, another story of this, right? Or like I've experienced this where you're caring for people and then you get this overwhelming sense that they're just taking and taking and taking, and that like it doesn't matter how much you give to them, that they will take more. But I think some really good advice I've heard, or even the nice thing, I guess, about having a social work designation, that's part of why I chose this one, is that you can kind of move around, right? So like it's the part where you don't have to stay in the same job for 40 years anymore. People hop around. They'll do a couple years in, the extreme like family services or community mental health. And then they might do a couple years of private practice. And we have that happening a lot in our office, right? People that, they've done a decade in like very difficult casework. And then they just kind of need to take a breath from that. And they might go into a different area of mental health later, or maybe more research, or maybe more like advocacy kind of stuff where they're actually affecting those decisions about how we're implementing community mental health. So I just love that kind of flexibility. And I think for mental health providers, it's just like a healthy way to look at it. Today has been really interesting. I love talking about our collective experience as well as our individual experience and the interplay between the two. If you have any questions about what you heard today, if you have anything you'd like us to bring up on the air, we would love to hear from you. Our email is resetberry@gmail.com. and we'll see you next time.